Welcome back, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into a topic that might seem kinda ordinary at first glance. But trust me, there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. We're talking about habits, those everyday actions that we often do without even thinking.
And we'll be drawing insights from Wendy Wood's book, Good Habits, Bad Habits, to explore how these automatic behaviors shape our lives in ways we might not even realize.
Exactly. We often hear about the importance of willpower and self-control for achieving our goals, but this deep dive is going to reveal why that approach often falls short.
It turns out that our brains are wired to rely on habits much more than we might like to admit.
The book kind of kicks things off by challenging this idea of homo economicus, that whole concept that we're all perfectly rational beings, constantly making decisions based on logic and maximizing our own benefit.
Right, the idea that if we just set our minds to something and exert enough willpower, we can achieve anything.
Hmm.
But psychology over time has shown that's not really how things work.
Yeah, I mean, how many times have we set a New Year's resolution with the best intentions, only to find ourselves slipping back into old patterns a few weeks later? The book uses a great example, the author's cousin who was determined to lose weight.
She had the motivation, the knowledge about healthy eating, even access to gyms and support groups. Yet she struggled to maintain those healthy habits over the long term.
It's like we have this conscious part of our mind that sets goals and makes plans, but then there's this other part, the habit system, that's operating on autopilot, and it often wins out.
Exactly. The book describes it as a dual process mind. There's the conscious decision-making self, which Wood compares to a mental muscle that gets tired with effort.
And then there's this deeper automatic habit system that's constantly running in the background. It doesn't require much effort, so it can take over when our willpower wanes.
And that's where the real challenge of behavioral change lies. Wood's research, which she reviews in the book, actually found a surprisingly weak link between our intentions and our actual long-term behavior.
So it's not just about trying harder or setting stricter goals.
Not necessarily. Instead, we need to understand the mechanics of habit formation, how those automatic patterns get ingrained in our brains in the first place.
And a key factor, according to the book, is context. Habits are really tied to our environment and the routines we create. So if you want to build a new habit, you need to make sure the context is consistent.
The book gives a really interesting example, a study on voting behavior. They found that people who moved to a new location were less likely to vote in the next election, even if they had voted regularly in the past.
Oh, so simply because they were in a new environment, their old habit of voting didn't kick in. That's wild.
Exactly. The polling place, the routine they had, all those contextual cues were gone. And the book has another pretty unsettling example about driving.
You mean that statistic about most car accidents happening close to home? I remember reading that it's because familiarity can breed inattention. We become so used to driving those routes that our brains sort of switch off.
And we're not really consciously aware of it happening. Which leads to another crucial point. Habits actually operate on a different neural pathway in the brain than goal-directed actions. They become deeply ingrained, firing off automatically without us even having to think about it.
So it's like those times when you find yourself driving home from work and you can't even remember the details of the drive, like you were on autopilot the whole way.
Exactly. Or think about learning a new language. Rote memorization, just trying to cram vocabulary words, is easily forgotten. But if you practice speaking the language in specific contexts, you're much more likely to retain those skills.
Because you're building those neural pathways, those habits, through consistent practice. That's fascinating.
And now let's shift gears a bit and talk about self-control, because that's a concept that's often misunderstood. We tend to think of it as a constant struggle against temptation, this test of willpower.
Right, like the marshmallow test, where they put a marshmallow in front of a kid and say, you can have one now, or if you wait, you can have two later. And the kids are squirming, trying to resist that instant gratification. It's adorable, but it also kind of sets us up to think about self-control as this constant battle.
And what Wood's research suggests is that people with really high self-control may not actually be fighting those battles as much. It's more that their habits are already aligned with their goals, so they experience fewer of those unwanted desires in the first place.
So it's not about perpetually resisting temptation. It's about building habits that effortlessly support the life you want to live.
Exactly. And the book has this interesting study where people were trying to develop the habit of eating carrots, but they only succeeded when the context remained consistent. Any little change, and the habit would break down.
So like if they always ate carrots at their desk at work, but then tried to eat them in the break room, the habit wouldn't stick.
Exactly. Consistency is key. And this brings us to another important idea from the book, the power of friction and reward in shaping our actions. Even small changes in our environment can disrupt habits, making us more aware of our choices.
Like those annoying cookie warnings that pop up on every website now. It's like they're intentionally trying to make it harder to just mindlessly click accept.
Right. That's a perfect example of adding friction to disrupt a habit, and it makes us think about those choices more consciously. Another example the book uses is Uber's surge pricing.
Oh yeah, when the price of a ride suddenly jumps up during peak times. It's definitely annoying, but I guess it makes you stop and consider whether you really need that ride right now, or if you could wait or find an alternative.
And those are just a couple of examples. Think about how grocery stores are laid out. Those tempting snacks near the checkout counter, the way they arrange the aisles to encourage you to spend more time and money.
It's crazy how much of our spending might be influenced by those carefully designed environments without us even realizing it.
Right. It really makes you wonder how much control we actually have over our choices sometimes. So we've been talking about how powerful our environments can be in shaping our habits. But the book also explores how major life changes, those disruptions to our routines, can also create these opportunities for forming new habits. Wood calls it discontinuity.
It's like when something shakes up our normal patterns, we become more open to trying something different. The book mentions this fascinating example of a massive London tube strike. Commuters were suddenly forced to find new ways to get to work.
And what's really interesting is that this disruption actually led some people to discover more enjoyable and efficient ways to commute, which they stuck with even after the strike ended. They'd broken free from those old habits and stumbled upon something better.
It's like when you go on a vacation and break away from your usual routines. You might try new foods, explore different activities, or even discover hidden passions you never knew you had. And sometimes those experiences can have this ripple effect, influencing your habits even after you return to your normal life.
Exactly. So the question becomes, how can we intentionally harness the power of discontinuity in a positive way? Do we always need a massive strike or a global pandemic to shake things up?
Well, maybe not. I mean, we can introduce smaller disruptions into our own routines, like trying a new restaurant instead of going to your usual spot, or taking a different route to work.
Even something as simple as rearranging the furniture in your home can create enough of a shift to disrupt those automatic patterns and make you more aware of your choices. It's about infusing a sense of novelty into your everyday life.
To sort of jolt you out of those ingrained habits and see what other possibilities might be out there. I like that.
Now, let's transition to another critical aspect that Wood emphasizes the interplay between stress and habit. She argues that stress really depletes our executive control, making us more reliant on habits, both good and bad.
It's like when you're feeling overwhelmed and exhausted. All those healthy habits you've worked so hard to build can crumble, and the bad habits you thought you'd conquered can come roaring back.
Precisely. And there's a neuroscientific basis for this. Stress essentially hijacks our prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain responsible for decision making and self control.
So it's not simply a matter of lacking willpower or being weak. It's about recognizing how stress affects our brain's ability to function properly, making us more vulnerable to those automatic habitual responses.
Exactly. And this has major implications for how we approach habit change. Managing stress becomes essential not just for cultivating good habits, but also for avoiding those unwanted slips.
So it's not just about setting goals and designing our environments, it's also about prioritizing our mental and emotional well-being,
Yeah.
making sure we have the capacity to make conscious choices, even when things get tough.
Right. And Wood introduces this concept of habit slips, those moments when we automatically do something we didn't intend to do because our attention is elsewhere or we're feeling stressed.
Like absentmindedly reaching for a cookie even though you're trying to eat healthier, or snapping at a loved one even though you're striving to be more patient.
Exactly. And these slips can be incredibly frustrating, making us feel like we're failing. But it's important to remember that they're not a sign of weakness. It's just how our brains are wired.
So instead of beating ourselves up when we slip up, we should view those moments as opportunities to learn and adjust our strategies.
Precisely. And Wood provides some helpful tips for minimizing those slips, like identifying your triggers, developing backup plans for challenging situations, and practicing self-compassion when you inevitably stumble.
It's about approaching ourselves with kindness and understanding, recognizing that habit change is an ongoing journey, not a destination.
A journey that can ultimately lead to some really positive and lasting changes in our lives.
Speaking of journeys, the book also delves into a rather unexpected domain where habits play a powerful role: addiction.
Right. Wood challenges the traditional view of addiction as solely a disease of willpower. She highlights the influence of environmental cues and habit loops in maintaining those destructive patterns.
She uses the case of Vietnam War veterans who struggled with heroin addiction while overseas. What's striking is that many of them were able to break free from their addiction upon returning home.
Which raises the question, if addiction is purely a brain disease, why would a change in environment have such a profound impact?
Wood argues that the specific context of Vietnam, the intense stress, the easy access to heroin, the social norms within the military, all contributed to creating this potent set of cues that reinforced those addictive behaviors.
And when those veterans came home, those cues vanished. The stress diminished, heroin was less readily available, and they were no longer surrounded by peers engaging in those behaviors.
So the habit loop was broken. It's a powerful illustration of how our environments shape our habits, even those as challenging as addiction.
Exactly. It suggests that focusing solely on individual willpower might miss a crucial piece of the puzzle.
And the book explores alternative treatment models that emphasize modifying environments and cultivating new, healthy habits, rather than just focusing on abstinence and willpower.
Like programs that provide job training and social support to help people establish new routines and find positive reinforcement for sobriety. It's about creating a life where those destructive habits are no longer the easy default option.
Right. So it's not just about just say no. It's about creating a context where no becomes the natural choice.
Hmm.
This is all making me think about how much of our own behavior, even those patterns we find hard to change, might be influenced by things outside of ourselves.
Like environmental cues and social norms that we're not even consciously aware of, it's a really interesting question to consider.
It is. We often get so caught up in our own heads, focusing on our internal motivations and willpower, that we overlook the power of our surroundings.
Exactly. And this deep dive has only just begun to unravel the complexities of habit. But before we wrap up, let's explore one final fascinating aspect that Wood unveils the link between habit and our preferences, even our sense of meaning in life.
Okay, this sounds intriguing. I'm all ears.
It challenges this common belief that we develop habits because we inherently enjoy doing those things. Wood suggests that the relationship might actually work in the opposite direction.
Wait, so you're saying that we might actually start to enjoy things more simply because we do them repeatedly, even if we didn't like them at first?
Exactly. The book explores this phenomenon called mere exposure. It's this psychological principle where our liking for something actually increases with repeated exposure.
Okay, now that is super interesting. So it's not necessarily that we do things out of habit because we like them, but rather we might start liking them because they've become a habit.
Right. The book gives this really clever example using photographs of people's faces. They found that people actually preferred their mirrored image, the one they see in the mirror every day, over the true photographic image.
Wow, that's so counterintuitive. Why would that be?
Because it's the image they're most familiar with. Their friends, on the other hand, preferred the true photographic image, the one they were used to seeing.
Oh, I see. So familiarity breeds fondness, even at a subconscious level. We start to associate those repeated actions with positive feelings, even if we didn't initially enjoy them.
Which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it, right? This means that if we can stick with those healthy habits long enough, we might actually start to enjoy things we once found difficult or unpleasant.
Like exercise, I can definitely relate to that. The first few times I go to the gym after a long break, it's pure torture. But once I get into a regular routine, it starts to feel good.
Exactly. The book even mentions a study where people who successfully built a regular workout routine actually reported an increased desire to go to the gym. The habit itself seemed to make them enjoy the activity more.
That's really encouraging. It means those initial days of forcing yourself to do something you don't really want to do can actually pay off in the long run. Not just in terms of the benefits of the habit itself, but in actually starting to like it.
And this connects nicely to the idea of rituals. Wood talks about how those repeated actions, even those that seem kind of insignificant, can bring a sense of comfort, control, and even meaning to our lives.
Like athletes who have these superstitious rituals they do before a game.
Exactly. Those rituals might not actually have any magical power to influence the outcome, but they provide a sense of agency, of control, in situations where there's a lot of uncertainty.
And even those everyday rituals, like our morning coffee routine or our bedtime wind down, can help us feel more grounded and stable, amidst all the chaos of life.
Right. It's almost like those familiar actions create a sense of order and predictability, helping us navigate a world that can often feel unpredictable and overwhelming.
And the fascinating thing is that the power of these rituals might not lie in what we're actually doing, but in the psychological comfort that repetition provides,
Absolutely. It's about creating those anchors in our lives, those moments of stability that help us feel more grounded and centered.
which is a really powerful takeaway. We can intentionally incorporate those small rituals into our days, whether it's to cultivate a sense of calm, enhance our focus, or just add a little bit of meaning to those otherwise mundane moments.
So, to wrap things up, this deep dive into habit has really revealed how much influence these often invisible forces have on our lives.
It's not just about efficiency or being a robot. It's about understanding how those small, everyday actions can shape our preferences, our well-being, even our sense of meaning and purpose.
And it's empowering to realize that we're not just passive recipients of our habits, we have the ability to understand them, change them, and ultimately use them to create the lives we want.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this topic so fascinating and relevant to all of us. Whether we're trying to break bad habits, build good ones, or simply understand the forces that shape our behavior, there's a lot to learn from diving deep into the world of habit.
And we encourage all our listeners to keep exploring this topic, keep experimenting with what works for you, and most importantly, keep diving deep.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.